Today, we are diving deep into the world of museums. We're going to ask a really important question. How are these huge old institutions finally starting to tell the stories that have been left in the shadows for way too long? All right, let's get into it. We tend to think of museums as these grand keepers of our collective memory, right? They lay out this big story of our past, our culture, basically who we are and where we came from. But that immediately brings up a huge question. If museums are telling one version of history, what about all the stories they chose not to tell? I mean, who gets to be a part of that official story, and who gets left out? Think about it. The very architecture of a classic museum, the giant columns, those massive echoing halls, it all screams authority. It's designed to feel permanent, like it's giving you the final, undisputed word on history. And this is what academics call hidden history. Now, what's so important to get here is that these stories aren't actually missing from the museum's collection. The objects are often sitting right there in storage or even on display, but their queer context, their real stories, have just been completely ignored or silenced for decades. So, how are museums starting to fix this? Well, one of the first big steps has been to create special, dedicated exhibitions. And we're going to look at two huge shows in the UK that took completely different routes to get there. Okay, so you've got these two shows taking totally different paths. On one hand, there's Tate Britain's Queer British Art. It was a massive, landmark show, for sure, but it followed a pretty traditional, historical A to B timeline. Then, on the other hand, you have Liverpool's Walker Art Gallery with Coming Out, which was super political, really personal, and basically invited you, the visitor, directly into the conversation. Now, to really get why some of the objects in these shows had such a massive impact, we need to talk about this idea of affect. It's not about what you think about an object, it's that raw, physical sensation you get from it. That gut punch feeling or a shiver down your spine? It's the feeling you have before your brain can even label it. And wow, at the Tate, no object showed this power more than Oscar Wilde's actual prison cell door. I mean, this thing isn't even a piece of art, but it completely stole the show and became the emotional heart of the entire exhibition. So this experience points to something really powerful called embodied knowledge. Look, lots of people know the story of Oscar Wilde's imprisonment. It's a fact you learn. But standing right there, in front of the actual physical door that held him, that transforms that abstract knowledge into something you feel in your bones. People were literally brought to tears in front of it. But that gut punch feeling doesn't just come from famous, dramatic objects. Just look at this simple, battered tin box. It's an incredible example of how a totally everyday item can hold so much power. It's filled with uniform buttons, clipped from guardsmen by a couple after secret meetups. It's a quiet, personal archive of their hidden life, of illegal relationships. It's like a tangible trace, what some call a queer residue, of lives that were lived completely outside the official record. Meanwhile, the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool took a totally different tack. Instead of just presenting objects, they spoke directly to you. The wall text asked things like, "What words do you use to describe yourself?" It completely changed the dynamic, turning the gallery from a place where you just passively look at stuff into a space for you to actively think about yourself. And the Walker went even further. They built a space called the Forum right inside the exhibition itself. This wasn't just for looking at art, it was a living, breathing community spot. They held workshops, dances, even a pop-up nail salon where you could get your nails done and chat with a trans activist. It was a space for doing things, not just seeing things. And here is exactly why that matters. A staff member told this incredible story about watching a young couple walk through the exhibit. Inside the space, they gradually became comfortable enough to hold hands. But the second they stepped back out into the main museum, they pulled apart. It's just such a powerful, heartbreaking reminder of how these exhibitions can create these temporary safe spaces, and why that work is so incredibly vital. But a temporary safe space is, it's temporary. The exhibition eventually comes down. And that reality has pushed some museums to start asking a much, much bigger and more radical question. What if this wasn't just about putting on a special show for a few months? What if you could actually change the entire DNA of the museum, its rules, its language, its very structure, to reflect a queer perspective all the time? And there are two institutions that are really leading the way here. You've got the Van Abbe Museum in the Netherlands, which is focused on what it calls deviant practice, basically changing its day-to-day operations. And then in Berlin, the Schwules Museum, or SMU, is all about radical self-critique, constantly questioning its own power.
At the Van Abbe Museum, the changes can seem really small, but they're actually huge. Things like getting rid of gendered titles like Mr. or Mrs. on their online forms, or having the volunteers who greet you at the door start questioning whether their own job titles need to be gendered. The goal isn't just to have a queer program, it's to make queerness the lens through which the entire institution looks at everything it does.
Now, the SMU in Berlin has this really fascinating backstory. It started out in the 80s as a grassroots activist project run by volunteers, but then, as you can see, it started getting city funding, upgrading its building. It became a much more polished, professional institution. And with that came this classic conflict. How do you keep your radical, activist soul once you become part of the establishment? Well, the SMU's answer was to turn its critical eye inward, on itself. They realized that their own history was mostly focused on the stories of gay men. So, they launched a Year of the Women, a whole year-long program to deliberately confront and correct their own internal biases and blind spots. This was not a smooth process, at all. It actually created a huge backlash from inside its own community. Critics, like this journalist here, accused the museum of abandoning its original purpose, saying it was basically destroying its own history. It just goes to show how much tension there is, even within the community, about whose stories should get top billing. So, where does all of this leave us? What does it all tell us about the future of museums? Well, all these different approaches, they really highlight a few core tensions that any institution trying to do this work is going to have to face. It really boils down to a few big questions. Do you try to make queer stories fit into the mainstream, kind of like the Tate's more cautious approach? Or do you use those stories to blow up the mainstream narrative entirely? Does becoming a slick, professional museum mean you automatically lose your activist edge? And maybe the biggest one, is real change a big, flashy temporary show? Or is it the slow, grinding, difficult work of changing an institution from the inside out? And this is where researchers frame all of this work as part of a queer, utopic longing. Now, that doesn't mean they're aiming for some perfect, impossible future. Instead, the utopia is the process itself. It's the messy, complicated, ongoing work of building a new collective memory, of acknowledging everything that's been lost, and just opening up new possibilities for what could be. And that really leaves us with one final big question to think about the next time you walk into any museum. Is its job to preserve one single official version of the past, or is its real purpose to become a space where many different, conflicting, and vibrant histories can all finally be told?